Intangibility has certain traits. To understand an intangible asset, we need to look at the traits of intangibility. What makes an asset an intangible asset? Economists have given certain traits, but when we come to the legal aspects of it, these traits will be important for us to understand so that we can give the character of intangibility to intellectual property assets, because intellectual property assets are the products that can be covered by an intellectual property right exhibit these traits. Intangibles, when we talk about intangibles, we are talking about ideas, commercial relationships, and know-how. Now, ideas can be protected, the expression of ideas can be protected by the copyright regime. Know-how, when it's translated onto a product which involves a technology, that can be protected by patents. Commercial relationships are largely protected by the law with regard to confidential information, or what we also call trade secrets. That's largely the contractual regime. You can have a contract with a person to whom you are disclosing relationships, commercial relationships, or commercially sensitive information, and bind that person through a non-disclosure agreement in such a way that a trade secret is protected. Now let's look at the 4 traits of intangibility. The first trait, as economists tell us, is scalability. The intangible asset is scalable. The second trait is sunkenness. The intangible asset is created by costs that is sunk, in the sense that it'll be hard to recover those costs. The third trait is spillover. Spillover in the sense that when an intangible asset is created, apart from the person who created the asset, others get benefit too. And fourth trait of intangibility is that it can cause synergies. Having one intangible asset and another asset together can cause synergy, which would normally not be the case if the assets are used separately. Now let's look at these 4 traits in detail. Though this is an account by economists, we will find that this holds good. This analysis of the 4 traits of intangibility holds good for a legal analysis as well. So first we look at the scalability aspect. We say something is scalable when there is no limit on the capacity to make those things. For instance, intangible assets have a trait of mass duplication. You can make multiple copies of an intangible asset. For instance, if it is a book, the intangible asset being the creative work of the author, then that book, you can make multiple copies of it without there being any decrease in the output of the book itself, in the sense that any person who reads the book gets an understanding of the book, the ideas covered in the book, without diminishing the asset. Now, economists call this as non-rival goods, or earlier it also used to be called as knowledge goods. Now, knowledge goods and non-rival goods tell us that there are certain goods that are non-rival in nature, especially this is true for intangible goods. Rival goods are goods which can be used by only one person or a group of people. When a group of people consume a good, it is simply not made available for others. For instance, a piece of a cake. A piece of a cake can be shared by a finite number of people. There are limitations to what you can do with a piece of a cake. A book, on the other hand, can also be read by one person, but the idea that is conveyed in the book, if the book is relayed, say, on YouTube, assume that the book is shown, the pages are flipped on the YouTube. Every person who can have access to the YouTube can read the book as the book is being flipped and get the complete understanding of the book as a person would get while reading the hard copy of the book. So when a video is made out of the book, in the sense that the reading of the book, a book is held in front of a camera and it is shot and it is relayed to hundreds and thousands of people. Every person who reads the book gets the same enjoyment or benefit out of the book, out of the idea that is communicated in the book, as it would be in the case of a person who physically reads one copy of the book. Now, this talks about the scalability. Intangible assets can be scaled to any number. Now, if you regard Microsoft's software, Windows, as an intangible asset, then you can see that any number of copies of a Windows program can be made without affecting the enjoyment of others. So this tells us that there are certain goods that are non-rival in nature. Rival goods are goods only few or finite number of people can consume. Non-rival or non-rivalrous goods are goods without physical limitations. There is no limit to the number of people who can consume that book. So sharing a book, and we are talking about not physical sharing, even the physical sharing, if you look at a book, if assume that a group of students sit next to each other and share and read from a common book. Now, all the students who look into the book and read from the book can actually derive the enjoyment from the book as it would be the case if they read the book separately. And this enjoyment each one of them gets does not affect the enjoyment of the other, in the sense that they get a complete understanding of the concepts mentioned in the book without affecting the enjoyment or the benefit that others get while reading the book. Whereas in the cake example, you simply cannot enjoy a cake without affecting others who are sharing that with you. Now, this example can be magnified, or we can take this example to a different level when we compare the number of people whom we can accommodate in a room. Now, normally in a classroom, you could have a teacher and a few students depending on the size of the classroom. Now, if you want to increase the number of people in that room, what you could do is you could remove all the furnitures and then you could put people there. Then, though it may look crowded, you can have, say, host a tea party or a lunch, and you can have more people standing there and utilizing the room. Now, if you want to use the room or rent the room for purposes of accommodating people, then you can put some beds and bunker beds if necessary, and you can slightly increase the number of people who can actually use the room for, say, as an accommodation. Now, you can extend this idea, but at the end, there will be a limit to the number of people who can actually enjoy the room. So that is a rival good. A room which has constraints of space and which has physical limitations, like a physical asset. A room has certain limitations as to how many people can actually use it. So if you stuff the room with more people than it can actually handle, then there could be some consequences which will go beyond what a person can handle. So a room is a typical example of a rival product. Now let's look at a room in the online space. For instance, a chat room, a room which people can use for chatting. There is absolutely no limitation as to how many people can chat in a chat room. Absolutely no limitation. Because what we have done here is that in a chat room, because it is created by an intangible asset, software, and because it exists in the internet or somewhere in the cloud, you can ensure that the number of people who are in the room can be boundless, it can be limitless. So physical assets have limitations, whereas there cannot be any limitation on intellectual assets. So another example that we can understand are the NPTEL classes themselves. Much different from a normal class, an NPTEL class would allow any number of students who have access to the internet and to YouTube to have access to these classes. So what in effect happens in an NPTEL class is that the intangible nature of the delivery, which is by using software, the voice and the video of a professor who has recorded the lecture is now delivered to a limitless number of people. There is absolutely no limit to the number of people who can enjoy or who can use an NPTEL class. So this talks about the scalability aspect of intangible assets. Intangible assets by definition are scalable. For instance, somebody writes a book, the book can be protected by copyright. Now the number of copies you can make of the book is infinite, especially if you convert the book into some kind of an e-format, say an e-format or an e-copy or a Kindle copy of a book. So there is absolutely no limit to how you can scale an intangible asset. Now, intangible effect, the scalability is also affected by what we call the networks effect. The networks effect is simply that if more people have telephone connections, the network effect makes it easy to scale up and it brings more benefit to people. Now, we see that in WhatsApp. The more people who have WhatsApp, the more it becomes easier to communicate with those people. So scalability is enhanced by the networks effect. 2. Sunkenness. Sunkenness refers to the cost of creation that went into the creation of the intangible asset, what we call the investment that went into creation of the intangible asset. Now, sunkenness is there almost in every asset, both in tangible, that is physical, as well as intangible assets. But the probability or the possibility of recovering the cost is much difficult when it comes to an intangible asset. Now, this is also referred to as the cost of creating the first copy. For instance, Microsoft Windows would have expended enormous amount of resources in coming up with the first copy of Windows, or a few years back we had something called the Vista. Now, Vista is now a discontinued product. What happens to the cost that has gone into the creation of Vista? Vista being an intangible asset. Now, the cost that went into creating the software is simply cannot be recovered now. So in that sense, it is much harder to recover the cost that goes into intangible asset than it is in the case of a tangible asset. For instance, land, building and factory which belong to a company can at any time be sold if the business doesn't move forward. Whereas intangible assets like list of customers, for instance, or operation procedures in a showroom. There is a company which runs a showroom and they have a operation procedure which only suits that showroom. So if they had spent enormous amount of time in creating that intangible effect, the manual of operations, it will be very hard for them to use that manual in another surrounding or in another situation. Now again, the sunkenness cost can be understood in what we saw in Gilead's Sovaldi. Sovaldi, as we saw, was a drug which Gilead acquired when it took over the company Pharmaset. And Pharmaset was valued at $11 billion at the time of its purchase. But we know that Pharmaset was absorbed into Gilead's company, and the drug later on became a blockbuster drug, getting revenues in excess of 20 million in the year 2017. Now, all the money that went into creating Pharmaset and the drug, the potential drug, which was later on acquired by Gilead and which later on got approved as Sovaldi, it will not be possible to recover those costs, the R&D, the teams and all the equipments that went into creation of the drug. The creation of the drug may get monetized when the drug becomes a bestseller. For instance, let's look at another drug which, say, hypothetically developed by the same company, for which there was no recovery of cost. A drug that eventually led to a failure, or probably the drug did not reach the market. Now this tells us that when we are dealing with intangibles, intangible assets have a cost that is sunk into it, which may be harder to recover than in the case of a physical asset. And physical asset, as we all know, like land, building and factory, even if there is no need to continue with the particular business, you should be able to sell the land, building and equipment in a factory and get some cost recovered by say a lump sum sale or a piecemeal sale. So unlike a physical asset, intellectual property assets or intangible assets become hard for people to recover the cost that has gone into it. Now, a good example is Kingfisher Airlines. Kingfisher Airlines, we know that had pledged its brand, furniture, and various other things for $1.2 billion for the loans that the company had taken. Now, a substantial part of this pledge relied on the brand of Kingfisher, and brand, as we know, is an intangible asset, and we know what happened later on. Kingfisher was not able to pay the debts, and it led to the closure of the company, and also and it also led to other complications for the promoter. Now, here is a case where the sunken cost into building the brand, whatever Kingfisher did to build the brand, is something which cannot be recovered, which the banks realized when they pledged a loan predominantly based on the brand. When loans are given based on a brand, which is an intangible asset, then it could lead to a situation like what we saw in the case of Kingfisher Airlines. This largely is due to the fact that the cost that goes into an intangible asset, into the creation of an intangible asset, is a sunk cost, and it becomes hard to recover that cost. 3. Spillovers. Spillover refers to the fact that the benefit of an intangible asset may accrue on others. Economists also call this as non-excludable nature of an intangible asset. An asset of intangible nature, when it is released or when it is used, it could lead to others getting benefited by it. For instance, when iPhone released the first phone in 2007, it created the smartphone category. The smartphone category was created by iPhone. Now, when Apple created this category, they were the market leaders. They were the ones who brought out a phone with a full touch screen without any dial pad. iPhone, though was the pioneer in this field, had to live with the fact that others would be creating smartphones as well. So, though iPhone created the category, Samsung, LG, Motorola, and others got the benefit of the spillover. So, in creating an intangible asset, there is a spillover which you may not be able to stop others from enjoying it. So, the owner, in effect, may not reap all the rewards of the product. So, one of the solutions that have been suggested to get over the problem of spillovers is to have government funding. So, all the basic work or research that is being done, if it is funded by the government, the follow-on work alone needs to be done by the market, and that would lead to a situation where the market develops something which has already been funded by the government. Now, for instance, the United States government funds 30% of the R&D that happens in that country. Now, the spillover is also something which could be potentially protected by intellectual property right. Now, the term of the IP refers to the timeline during which an IP cannot be used by others. An intellectual property cannot be used by others during the term of the IP. For instance, if there is a trademark protection over a brand, then the brand cannot be used by others. If there is a copyright protection over artistic work, the copyrighted work cannot be used by others. So we have this instance of how the term of an IP can be extended to protect the spillover effect. Disney, the creators of Mickey Mouse, had a life term for the copyright which would have expired in 1984. But Disney was able to successfully lobby and extend the life till 2023. Now, this happened by bringing in 2 amendments to the copyright term, which Disney had lobbied for in 1976 and 1998. So one way to get over the spillover effect is to have strong intellectual property rights, and one way to extend the intellectual property life itself is to have a longer term on the IP. 4. Synergies. The value of intangibles increase when they are combined with other intangibles. For instance, Apple is a company which has combined software, hardware, and a supply chain to come up with elegant and user-friendly products which can reach any part of the world with a very short time. You would know that all the iPhone releases, they were close to global launches, and the copies were available, or the models were available as soon as they were globally launched to other parts of the world as well. Coca-Cola is another company which combines the synergies of a brand, which is an intangible, formula. There is this secret formula which Coke is supposed to have developed, and it protects it, and a distribution network. So these things add a synergy or create a synergy which gives Coca-Cola a lead over other competitors. Now, innovation itself has been defined as something that happens when ideas come together. So, so synergy is something which promotes the creation of an intangible asset. And many a times, the synergy itself gives an advantage to the producer. The producer, because of the synergy he has in the company or in the enterprise that is run by the producer, because the producer has certain synergies, it is possible for the producer to come up with new intangible assets by way of combining existing assets. Now, 2 of the business models that we know today, Uber and Airbnb, are models that existed before. Hiring a cab was something which people knew, and renting out premises, say for the use of a paying guest, was something which we already knew. But the synergy caused by the availability of smartphone and the connectivity of smartphone actually allowed these models to flourish. So you can see that Uber is a model that could only work if people have smartphone, and Uber developed apps for it. Airbnb similarly is a model that will only work if people are connected over the internet and they are able to show their property and engage with others who are interested in staying in those properties. So synergy is another aspect or another trait of an intellectual. Synergy is another trait of an intangible asset. Now, what is the outcome of these 4 things? So the outcome of these 4 traits of intangibility is that 1, it causes uncertainty, and 2, it causes contestedness. Uncertainty because there is an intangibles by their nature. We saw that because of the sunkenness and because of the spillover that intangibles create, it is hard to ascertain and derive the value of an intangible. Now, Coca-Cola may be able to value its brand at a very high price. There simply may not be anybody to buy the brand because of its valuation, because of the uncertainty that goes into the valuation of the brand. We saw in the case of Kingfisher Airlines, the brand and some properties were together pledged for 1.2 billion. Now, when it turned out the banks were not able to recover this value, though they had pledged money equivalent based on the brand predominantly. So there is uncertainty that comes out of an intangible asset, and intangible assets by definition are investments that are of an uncertain nature. So there is uncertainty. And second thing is that we need to understand about these 4 traits contribute to contestedness. There are disputes with regard to intellectual property rights that constantly arise because the nature of the intellectual property right leads it to be contested. When a patent is granted by the patent office, when the patentee enforces the patent, it allows the patentee to stop others from doing things in that particular area. And if it is something that ought not to have been granted a patent, say a technology which was already there, or a technology which was obvious to people in that art to come up with, or a technology which was in the public domain but only few people knew about it, for various reasons an intellectual property right may get contested. So contestedness is another outcome of intangible assets.